Welcome to Costa. My name is Costa Mwansa. My guest this evening to discuss this very important, subject is Professor Patrice Lumumba, a Kenyan-born professor of public law, an advocate of the High Courts of Kenya and Tanganyika, a Pan-African scholar and author himself. We all remember that Professor Lumumba was denied entry into Zambia a couple of years ago, but technology this evening has made it very possible for him to come into Zambia via Diamond Television and discuss this very important subject in honoring a great Pan-African. Professor Patrice Otieno Lumumba, it's a pleasure to host you on Costa, and welcome to this interview in honoring an African icon and a Pan-African legend.
Thank you very much. When you introduced me as Patrice, people will confuse me for Patrice Emery. So it's better you call me by my popular name, PLO Lumumba, so that we are not confused that Patrice Emery is alive again.
Indeed.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and let me condole with the people of Zambia following the departure of Kenneth David Kaunda.
Before we get to discuss, Pan-Africanism, Professor, or rather before we discuss, Dr. Kaunda himself, I would want us to start on the context of Pan-Africanism, because we know that KK himself was, proponent of Pan-Africanism. In Zambia, he believed in the One Zambia, One Nation, slogan. In Africa, he believed in a one continent, hence his fight for the emancipation of other Africans which were under colonial rule, and also in the world, he believed in the aspect of mankind and humanism. But I think the far-reaching question this evening is, what really went wrong with the Pan-Africanism movement of Mwalimu Nyerere, of Kwame Nkrumah, and Kenneth Kaunda?
Let us begin, if you may, from the beginning. The Pan-African movement is a little older. You must, in the context, mention Africans in the diaspora, such as people like Marcus Garvey of Jamaica, Williams of Trinidad and Tobago, W.E.B. Du Bois, some would talk about the Lancaster, rather the Manchester meetings in 1945. Go back to the continent of Africa, or come back, depending on the context in which one is speaking, and remember the Casablanca group, which was bringing together the more progressive elements such as Kwame Nkrumah, Julius Kambarage Nyerere, Modibo Keita, Amilcar Cabral, Ahmed Ben Bella, and the Monrovia reactionary group that put together people such as Felix Houphouët-Boigny. And then that brings us very quickly to the meeting that was held in the month of May, on the 25th day in 1963 in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, where Kwame Nkrumah was quite clear. I think in that regard, Kwame Nkrumah must be seen, if you may, as the chief high priest of the entire movement of Pan-Africanism. And alongside him, people like Julius Kambarage Nyerere. And when you pose the question, what went wrong, it is exactly what Kwame Nkrumah said would go wrong. He told his colleagues on that day that the fact that we have regained independence does not mean that the colonial enterprise is dead. He actually said that imperialism will come under different guises, that it will wear different masks, and he wrote a book about it, Neo-colonialism, the last stage of imperialism, and perhaps the deadliest. So that no sooner had many African countries regained independence than the neo-colonial project was rolled out, and rolled out sometimes in a very subtle way, sometimes in a very blatant way. And that is why the Osage for Kwame Nkrumah will say, let us unite now. Let us have one government now. Let us have one army now. Let us have one currency now. Let us unite, because if we don't, we'll be weak and susceptible to manipulation. And of course, nobody listened to him. And instead of a United States of Africa, we ended up with a very weak organization, the Organization of African Unity, which was founded in 1963. Of course, Ghana had not regained her independence. It did so a year later, and Kenneth David Kaunda was not in Addis Ababa on the day of the formation of the OAU. And OAU therefore started from a standpoint of weakness. The continent already divided into Lusophone, or rather Lusophone was not there at that time because the Portuguese independence regained their independence a little later, but the Francophone countries led by people who are merely acolytes, such as Felix Houphouët-Boigny, Leopold Sédar Senghor could pretend, but essentially was a Francophile. And the British were also going all the way to remain in control of their colonies. And it is this manipulation that then saw the progressive elimination of those who were pro-Pan-Africanism. There may be debate, but as early as 1963 in Togo, they have eliminated Sylvanus Olympio. In the Democratic Republic of Congo in 1961, they have eliminated Patrice Emery Lumumba. And of course, they come in Ghana in 1966, they eliminate Kwame Nkrumah. They overthrow Nnamdi Azikiwe and Abubakar Tafawa Balewa. They eliminate Modibo Keita. They eliminate Ahmed Ben Bella. There's in the 1960s, there are mutinies in a number of African countries. In Tanzania, there is a mutiny which is engineered against President Nyerere. There is a mutiny against Apollo Milton Obote. So all these diabolical machinations from outside of the continent, using the acolytes of the erstwhile colonizer, then torpedo the vision of Nkrumah and Nyerere and Modibo and Ben Bella and Lumumba and all those. And we have never recovered from that. There have been attempts at re-energizing the movement, but the political leadership has always been compromised. Whenever a new crop of leaders try to emerge to give impetus to the Pan-African movement, they have been neutralized, both internally and externally.
You give a very thorough, and analytical historical perspective, beginning from obviously the Gold Coast, then in Ghana with Nkrumah, and obviously the fact that in 63 into the early 70s, most of these leaders begin, being eliminated. But I want us to drive, further into now, southern, Africa. At that time when those leaders you mentioned, Modibo Keita and Nyerere, Ben Bella, are out of the picture, Zambia gains independence. But KK realizes that, Angola, with, the UNITA rebels and the movements, Mozambique is not independent, Zimbabwe is not independent, Malawi obviously came in around the 60s. We see a period in the 70s of even things like the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland, which brought a lot of problems for Kenneth David Kaunda back home, because many resources from copper mining went to Salisbury. They went, into Lilongwe. Was this, worth the while, that Zambia could not be independent if its neighboring brothers and sisters were not independent? Was this a worthwhile fight to soldier on with the Pan-African, vision in the 70s all the way into the 80s?
And that is the greatness of President Kaunda, that Kaunda heads a nation which is in itself surrounded by shackled nations, because, as you rightly say, the Nyasaland Federation, Kamuzu Banda comes in, and Kamuzu is an Anglophile. Kamuzu is pulling in a totally different direction from everybody else. He is having a rapport with the apartheid regime in South Africa. He is generally friendly to the Ian Smith regime. He doesn't speak Chichewa. He's a totally different kettle of fish, and he says that the Nyasaland Federation must go. But Kaunda, who is echoing the arguments of Kwame Nkrumah and his friend Kambarage Nyerere, say that the freedom of Zambia means nothing. If Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, is not free, it means nothing if Nyasaland, now Malawi, essentially is not free. It means nothing if South Africa is not free. Mozambique, Namibia, and Angola. And he becomes the arrow's head, if you may, of this entire struggle. And after Kamuzu, of course, frees Malawi and renames it and becomes Dengwazi, as he calls himself, the only person who is then left who is wedded to the Pan-African theory of, not only theory, the Pan-African vision of freedom for all African nations is Kenneth David Kaunda. He doesn't look south, he looks north. He looks to Julius Nyerere in Tanzania. He looks to Apollo Milton Obote in Uganda, because Kenyatta in Kenya is also footloose, is not an out-and-out Pan-Africanist. In fact, his hidden desire is to hobnob with the South African regime, becomes very friendly with Kamuzu Banda, but is not as clear, is ambivalent. So clarity comes with Nyerere, clarity comes with Obote, and Nyerere and Obote and Kaunda then formed the Mlungushi Club, which you'll be familiar with. But even before that, Kaunda is of the view that even as we pursue armed struggle, which is of course brought about by a number of reasons, the Portuguese are a dictatorship even at home with Marcelo Caetano and Antonio de Spinola. They are not letting the colonies free. So he begins, Kenneth Kaunda, to hobnob initially with Eduardo Mondlane until he's killed in Dar es Salaam by a letter bomb, then has camaraderie with Samora Moises Machel. He hobnobs with Joshua Nkomo, who I think he preferred, and he hobnobs with Agostino Neto, and at that time with Holden Roberto and even Unita, Jonas Malheiro Savimbi and Samuel Yoma in Namibia, and Andy Mbahama and Toivo ya Toivo. Of course, the ANC has been present since 1912, and the chief architects at that time, Walter Sisulu, Nelson Mandela. So rather, Kaunda becomes the fulcrum of what later we begin to know as the frontline states. But he is a little bit of a different genre of leaders. He thinks that in as much as armed struggle is necessary, because he's now responding to the reality, there is Frelimo, there is MPLA, there is SWAPO, which are armed groups, and Umkhonto weSizwe in South Africa. But he says we also must negotiate, if it is possible. And you remember that he enters into underground negotiation with the Smith administration and even with the Foster administration, which brings him a lot of problems. They say that he's wavering until Nyerere comes to his aid and says what Kaunda is doing cannot be dismissed, because we are dealing with people who militarily are stronger than us. And you remember at one time an armed detachment of the South African regime almost reached Angola and was heading to Lusaka. And therefore his pragmatism is what makes him a great leader, that he was able to balance the extremists and the moderates, and he midwifed a process which ultimately saw the liberation of the entire Southern Africa.
Professor Lumumba, from a modern day perspective, one would question and, probably weigh in to say, was it worth it from an economic emancipation perspective? Yes, we've been independent in 1964. Now we need to build on an economy that is, managed and run by indigenous Zambians. But we spend much of our time in the 70s and 80s trying to unshackle, our neighbors at the expense of, internal economic, growth. Just like you've rightly put it, you've got Frelimo, you've got MPLA, with even wars in the Congo that up until now have not yet, settled. Zambia, like you've rightfully put it, because of, housing, people like, Tabombeki, Oliver Reginald Tembo, the Sisulus, even when Samora was, visiting, Zambia, people like Zinzi, Mandela and them were still being, held, in terms of amnesty here in Chilenji and in many parts of Lusaka. Zambia experienced, sanctions, bombings even in an era called, the cha-cha-cha. So one would again weigh, when you look at it now, had Zambia lost out from liberating itself economically, or again, like I'm asking, has this battle paid off one or the other?
It will not pay off in your lifetime and my lifetime. And that is the greatness of visionaries, that they are capable of looking at a future date. They don't do things to have the results or the fruits realized in their time. Because what KK and his comrades in arms realized, that the long-term health of Zambia not only demanded but required that you are surrounded by people who largely think like you do. You imagine that Zambia had ignored what was happening down in Ian Smith's Rhodesia at that time, now Zimbabwe, or ignored what was happening in Angola or in the larger SADC region. There is a sense in which stability in the long term would have been undermined. So that what he said, let us sacrifice now that future generations may benefit. The question you may ask me immediately, but has that come to pass? Not yet, because we are measuring the success of nations against our very short lifetimes. In my view, you look at the life of nations into eternity, so that the fruits of what the Kaundas did will possibly be seen in their full splendor in the next 200 years. And if you think like that, then you don't judge people very harshly, because the life of nations, they are the golden periods, then they are the dark periods. But I think that the foundation stone that was laid by the Kaundas of this world is a firm foundation. The winds of chance may shake them occasionally when you have leaders who have no vision, but the foundation remains firm and steadfast.
Yeah. You talk about the formation of the Organization of African Unity in '63, and obviously there's things we've talked about happening in the '70s, the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland, and all these, clusters. But moving further to the '80s, Zimbabwe then, gets its independence around, '84, with Robert Mugabe coming in. Later in the '90s, the apartheid era in South Africa, ends. And vividly, for many, Zambians and young ones, including myself, is that when Nelson, Madiba Mandela is released, Kaunda sends, a Zambian Airways DC-10 Challenger into Johannesburg, and the first African, country and capital Madiba lands on is Lusaka, Zambia. Coming to the 90s, obviously a wave of a democratic dispensation starts sweeping across Southern Africa. Kaunda himself is ousted. The question therein lies: did we begin to see a shift of Pan-African leadership in the 90s after the end of the apartheid era at that point? And was this the decline of the OAU, which you earlier described as one that failed the Pan-African vision?
No, you've got to go a little bit farther in history. Remember that immediately after countries started regaining independence, two superpowers which had not been colonizers in the classical sense had now started emerging after the World War II. This is the United States of America and the Soviet Union at that time. And there was another scramble, ideological scramble for Africa. And that ideology was one that was informed by political and economic models. And that is why you saw in the early 1980s, many African leaders who were also Pan-Africanists were teetering towards single-party statehood. You see it in Tanzania, you see it in Zambia, you see it in Ghana, you see it in Kenya, you see it in Uganda. And that was very deliberate, because these individuals, they made mistakes without doubt, but they genuinely believed that the artificial countries that we inherited, which were gridlocked into the Berlin Wall boundaries, were multi-ethnic and therefore susceptible to ethnic manipulation. And they therefore took the view that if you had a single party which was a party that included everybody but allowed debate within itself, then ethnic manipulation would not come. That was tolerated during the whole period that you had a unipolar world. Some veered toward the Soviet Union. Kaunda, Nyerere, Obote looked to the east a lot more, to the Soviet Union. Some would say China and would explain the Tazara Railway in that regard. There were others like Mobutu Sese Seko in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and later we see other leaders who were of that ilk. Jean-Pédel Bokassa in Central African Republic, Felix Houphouët-Boigny, or Andimba, or rather this Omar Bongo, Denis Sassou Nguesso, and that crop of leaders. But later in the 1990s, but specifically in 1989, with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the weakening of that other sphere of power, the United States of America becomes the hegemon. And the hegemon that is using Europe, and they energize the former colonizers because they are cousins in one way. The French are alive, the Portuguese are alive at that time, of course the English are alive, the Belgians, and they now define for us what democracy is all about. They tell us democracy means multi-party politics. Democracy means that you must have a liberal economy. Democracy means that the state must recede from the market. Democracy means that the civil society must be energized. And you remember, this civil society that they are talking about is one that is financed by their own governments or their own NGOs. And they therefore see the leaders of the first generation leaders as an impediment to their new neo-colonial scheme. They started scheming against the Nyereres, scheming against the Kaundas, and scheming against the remnants. And at that time, it is only Nyerere and Kaunda that you can rightly describe as belonging to that generation. And the population is also animated in that way, because sanctions also come in. And when sanctions come in, it is the leaders who are then blamed. In your case, in the case of Zambia, the prices of copper also go down, and therefore the subsidies for the milli and other things go down, and the people think that the Kaunda administration is no longer performing, no longer delivering on the things that he promised. And then the Chilubas are now exploiting their trade union platform, and they appeal to the masses. And that is how you can explain the departure of Kenneth David Kaunda as being a combination of factors which are external and a combination and factors which are internal, but which are choreographed from outside.
With what you say, you set an agenda for the 2000s now, when liberal capitalism, economic systems are in play and democracies are flourishing, across, Africa. Again, it is Lusaka, Zambia, that is used to harness the transformation of the Organization of African Unity, OAU, into the African Union. Part of its pillar, fundamentals, it was to see or drive an Africa now from the economic front, where you'd see Africans have one passport, borderless, visa systems, with free trade, trading blocks in COMESA, in EAC, in ECOWAS, and so on and so forth. Aspects of Africa having, even one passport. The late Muammar Gaddafi as AU chair then, pushing that, Thabo Mbeki. But still, when you look at 2021, this is still far-fetched. It hasn't worked. If not, we've even gone back, because Africa is trading more with Europe, is trading more with China than it trades more within itself. The idea or ideology of having a rail connecting Africa from Cairo to the Cape of Good Hope is far-fetched 60, 70 years after the Pan-African movement. Why, Professor Lumumba?
But it is, the idea of having an Africa that is self-sufficient is one that has always been alive. But they also, the machinations of the erstwhile colonizers has always been alive. Because if Africa is truly independent, then countries like France will soon collapse. You therefore see that even as we talk of the Organization of African Unity, there are European initiatives that are designed to ensure that Africa remains independent. That is how you explain the Lomé Convention of 1975 about African Caribbean. That is how we explain the Cotonou Convention. But in 1980 in Lagos, Nigeria, under the Lagos Plan of Action, the African leaders meet in Lagos and they say, one of the things that we must do is to reduce our dependence on European countries and the United States, and indeed other countries that are emerged, such as Japan. And this can only be achieved, as you've rightly said, by increasing and enhancing intra-African trade. And they are able to identify that what stands in the way of African success is tariff and non-tariff barriers. But you'll also remember that at that time, African economies have become weak. Why? We are exporters of primary products, no value addition. They simply have to gang up against us. Then the IMF and the World Bank come in and say structural adjustment. What do? All institutions, parastatals, either owned by the state or where the state had the majority and controlling interest, is now sold to the private sector. And structural adjustment means, among other things, freezing jobs, freezing this, and they continue their machinations. I'm using this word frequently this evening: diabolical, subtle, subterranean, sometimes covert, sometimes overt, by continuing to manipulate us. And you see, therefore, not only in Zambia, in East Africa, they ensure that the East African community is dead. In West Africa, where the ECOWAS had been founded in 1975, they continue to create the impression that you, the French colonies, must still look to Paris because your currency is also one CFA franc. They continue to ensure that there are conflicts, and that is how you explain the situation in Sierra Leone, in Liberia. You know there is the problem in Guinea-Bissau, in the Sahelian region of Mali, Mauritania, Burkina Faso, Central African Republic. So all these factors put together undermine the vision that we had, the elimination of tariff and non-tariff barriers, and that is when Gaddafi comes in. Gaddafi and his ilk, they say, in order to change the scenario, what we must do is to reorganize the OAU, African Renaissance with Thabo Mbeki. The South Africa is now independent. Thabo Mbeki comes with African Renaissance. Gaddafi comes with the Sirte Agreement, says, let us call this the African Union and change how it operates and create a more intimate relationship amongst the regional bodies. ECOWAS to strengthen on that arm. East African Community also comes alive again in 1999. SADC is created. COMESA comes into being. Central Africa, and of course the Maghreb. The Arabs sometimes are unclear whether they want to be with us. Sometimes it suits them, sometimes it is not. But all those factors are telling us, you see a number of things happening at that time. The Yamoussoukro Agreement on the freeing of the airspace. Later, we see the Kigali Agreement on the question of a single passport. We see something happening in Malabo in Equatorial Guinea. We see Maputo. We see Abuja. Whether if it is not on health, it is in agriculture. African countries know the right thing. But once again, my brother, the neo-colonizer never sleeps.
We know the right thing, like you've rightfully put it, and we have we have most of these treaties or agreements on paper, and I wouldn't put them as best as you have, whether it's from Yamoussoukro to Abuja Declaration, you know, on health, whether it's Maputo on agriculture and so on and so forth. But the puzzling thing, PLO Lumumba, is that it takes an African flying, you know, from Lusaka, wanting to get into Bamako, Mali. He has to go into Europe to get a connection, you know, flight. So we know the right thing to do. What draws back the practicability of trying this, test it, fail it, and correct it? Others even say probably this may not work out if we mirror it against the failure of the EU that started later than OAU, but has finally crumbled with the breakaway in the Brexit, scenario?
Poor leadership. This really falls. Africa falls on poor leadership. In 2013, when the leaders meet again on the 25th day of May in 2013 in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, on the 50th anniversary of the Organization of African Unity, Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma is now the chair of the AU Council, and everybody has been persuaded that we have entered into these agreements that are listed and that and we appear not to solve our problems. Our diagnosis is right, but whenever we apply what we think is an antidote, a new wound appears. Let us now come up with something. And that is how we come up with Africa Agenda 2063 and ultimately the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. But what is the problem? The problem is the quality of the men and women who are presiding over individual African countries. They do not have the vision of Kenneth Kaunda. They do not have the vision and conviction of Kwame Nkrumah or Julius Nyerere or Modibo Keita or Thomas Sankara or Samora Moises Machel. And the net effect is that they think like villagers. And when you have people who are in positions of leadership who think like villagers, who think that Zambia in and of itself, landlocked or land-linked, if you may, can survive of its own accord, it is misguided. When Eswatini thinks the same, when Lesotho thinks the same, then we are sitting ducks. In 1963, in the book Africa Must Unite, Kwame Nkrumah said, our countries are divided into small and unviable units. If we continue in this way, we will never realize our goals because other powers who are better organized, who are bigger, with better resources, will confuse us. And you can see it during your lifetime. You can see in the streets of Lusaka what is happening with the advent of the Chinese. Because we are weak, they are coming.
You touch on a very important comparison on leadership, by vision, leadership by meritocracy. How would we weigh in on Africa's current leaders versus the Sankaras, the Lumumbas of Congo, the KKs then? Because some school of thought, PLO Lumumba would say leaders like Milton Obote, Museveni now, KK even, because of one-party state, were dictators. Even if we call them visionaries, they were not democratic because of the one-party state. How do we weigh in this generation of leaders who mutilate, constitutions to extend, their tenure, infringe on citizens' human rights? Are they not the same with the Kaundas who had a one-party state?
First of all, I don't support leaders who extend their terms in office. I believe that if you are a good leader, you must be in the position of nurturing others so that you hand over the baton and you see them serve in your lifetime. And I would say that in as much as currently speaking, we are very poor quality leaders in Africa, very poor quality, but there are few who stand out for the right thing that they do. They may have done things that are not universally acceptable, but in the recent past, I've seen Paul Kagame post-genocide in Rwanda has demonstrated that you can, in very difficult circumstances, mold the nation, make the right decisions, and do the right thing. Yoweri Kaguta Museveni did make sense in the first 10 years. After 10 years, he has been on a downward spiral. He's a good friend of mine. He's been on a downward spiral. And that is unfortunate. Mugabe, after 10 years, made sense. But he overstayed his welcome. John Joseph Pombe Magufuli, within 5 years, demonstrated the only thing that they are accused of all this good is that they trample underfoot the rights of individuals, namely their human rights. But there is a sense in which that must be explained. This thing that we call democracy as defined to us by the West. You have robbed in many African countries. We have people in opposition, some of whose expenses are underwritten by Western organizations. Some of them are resident in Belgium. Some of them are resident in Sweden. Some of them, and whenever they are speaking, they are not speaking for themselves. They are speaking for those who pay them. But the most important thing is that you must remember that African nations are not easy to govern. Look at the Democratic Republic of Congo, which has never known stability since the death of Patrice Lumumba. 300 nationalities in one nation is not easy. And when you call for political parties to be created, you end up with 133 political parties. You go to a country like Tanzania, which has been the most successful country in post-independence Africa in terms of creating unity amongst ethnicities, over 136 nations. You come to Zambia. And therefore, when we talk about democracy, you will see that even the politicians of the day, even in Zambia now, you are facing an election. The mobilization is ethnic. The mobilization is not on ideology. And that is why what the Kaundas and the Nyereres and the Nkrumas were trying to deal with says, because we inherited these boundaries, because it is possible for us to be divided along ethnic line by manipulation, let us build an edifice called a single party. And once ideas have become the dominant way of doing things, we can begin to free the political space. Look at China. Why is it that China, the way it is, even as we speak now, is a single party state? Because they realize that if you free these things and you follow Europe and America blindly, you are going to find yourself in trouble. And permit me just to explain. Look at the entire Europe. Look at the typical European nation. You go to Sweden, is one Swedish nation with a small Finnish population. Go to Finland, the same. Go to Netherlands, is the same. Go to Spain, rather to Portugal, is the Portuguese. Come to Spain, where there are many other groups. They were in a civil war. Come to Italy, it is the same. Come to France, it is the same ethnicity. Go to England, where they have the Scottish and the Irish and the Welsh. See the conflict that is there. See the former Soviet Union, how it broke up into creating ethnically pure nation. It is not easy. And for that, we must be very wary of introducing systems of governments which are imported from Europe and America, which never worked there, but they want to judge us on. It is important that we ought to go back to the basics and ask ourselves, what are the democratic models that we can put in place in order to ensure that we reduce conflict? Because whenever there is conflict, we undermine social cohesion and also undermine economic progress, all to the detriment of the people.
With that tone set, Professor Lumumba, and when one looks at, global politics now, with the Trump era that came out very strongly with an America First, kind of leadership, you've already touched on the problems with the border war between, England and Ireland and Brexit and the problems it causes. Spain, you give an example again, the breakaway between Catalonia and mainland Spain. China again is on its own as a global super economic power. Russia has its own issues within NATO and just how it positions itself with Georgia and Crimea. What I'm saying is then this does not give us so much hope that in this time or in future generations we're going to see a united Africa with the fundamentals or objectives of the visionaries like Nkrumah, Nyerere and Kaunda. The question then is it possible to achieve in the nearby future something like an African continental free trade area within these clusters to unite in positioning ourselves within these global geodynamics that I've mentioned, where each country is looking inward before they go out, to trade?
I'm very confident that if we work on the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, then Africa can achieve unity. Sometimes I think there is a very naive kind of argument that unity means oneness. It is unity in diversity. Unity in appreciating our differences within the continent. And one of the things that unites people is trade. I mean, even within Zambia, if you talk about trade amongst communities before the advent of colonization, conflict will always be there because it is in the nature of human affairs. It is how we mediate those conflicts that then becomes very important. And I hold the view that if we remove all these artificial boundaries and retain them only for purposes of administration, in the next 25 years, we'll begin to move towards greater economic and social integration of the continent of Africa, as has been demonstrated. And I think Tanzania serves as a beautiful example in that regard. That within 24 years of being presiding over Tanzania, because of vision, because of selflessness, Mwalimu Julius Nyerere, because he had moral authority and personal example, succeeded in welding together 136 different nations into a country. And despite the attempts by people within and without, Tanzanians on average think of themselves as one nation. With that example, it tells me that if you address the things that affect people want food on the table. People want good infrastructure. People want good health systems. People want to realize the things that make them happy. People want good education. If you address those things, then whether you are Mnyanja or a Bemba becomes a very secondary issue. It becomes something that you celebrate about your dances and about your cultures in marriage. But what is fundamental is that all of you will have food on the table, and beyond the basics, you are able to enjoy life however you define it. You have television, you have music, and you are free to travel from Dakar to Cape Town without using a passport. And I think that the United States of America, despite her problems, has also succeeded in demonstrating that once you deal with the critical issues that affect human life, then you are capable largely to create a nation that is united. Of course, the United States is not a good example. We know how persons of color continue to suffer in that country. But I'm saying that don't look at a continent and a people in the context of the span of your own lifetime. Look at generations, and you will agree with me that the building blocks are now there. The tragedy of Africa has many tragedies. One of the problems is that the current crop of politicians that we have now see politics as an avenue of gaining material wealth. So that in many African countries, we have tenderpreneurs, we have thieves, and in many African countries, we have kleptocracies. Kenneth David Kaunda, when he died, records show, they differ this record, that he had no more than the equivalent of $8,000 in his account. No home outside of Africa. Compare Kenneth David Kaunda with any of your leaders, excluding Levi Mwansa.
With that said, and earlier on you touched on an issue of what the 90s and the 2000s brought with democracy, structure adjustment programs, civil society driven, advocacy, and so on, the era of restructuring economies with the World Bank and the IMF. It brought dependency on loan agreements that had all these, undertones and connotations to signing these agreements. Do you see a second or third scramble or neocolonialism in Africa right now, that we still, when you look at continents, we still remain globally viable and attractive in terms of virgin land and raw materials, minerals, oil, and gas? Do you see a second or third scramble for Africa by the West and the East? And again, the question is, this value addition that we talk about in Africa, this self-emancipation which doesn't seem to be working, how should we be positioning ourselves?
Brother, the scramble is on. The scramble is on. I listened to the president of France, Macron, attending the funeral of Idriss Déby Itno. He addressed Malians, rather Chadians, as if Chad was a province of France. Their troops are there. The troops from France are in Burkina Faso. They are in Central African Republic. They are in Mali. They are in Mauritania. They are in Cameroon. They are in Gabon. The Chinese are present. Their troops, their people are entering into military pacts with the Chinese. The Russians are in Sudan. The Americans are in Djibouti. So militarily, there is a sense in which they are here. The Americans are coming to Kenya to help the Kenyan administration fight Al-Shabaab. They are in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The scramble is there militarily. The scramble is there economically. If you look at the economic environment in any African country, our infrastructure in Kenya, in Zambia, in Lesotho, in Ghana, is all being done by the Chinese at the intellectual level. And I'm sure at the University of Lusaka, there is what they call the Confucius Institute. They are there in Nairobi, they are there in Dar es Salaam. Intellectually, they are here with us. And if you go to the African Union, they built our headquarters, and they are right now beginning to build the Center for Disease Control for the entire African continent. The scramble is on, and you can see that the Americans are also back now. Instead of us entering into multilateral arrangements within our regions, the Americans are now entering into bilaterals with individual countries. And unfortunately, the current crop of African leaders, save for very few, were incapable of seeing it. Magufuli saw it very clearly. Kagame sees it very clearly. I've had a conversation with President Chakwera of Malawi. He sees it very clearly. Museveni sees it clearly sometimes. But there is a sense in which Akufo-Addo in Ghana sees it quite clearly. But apart from those that I have mentioned, I don't see any other leader. Even Cyril Ramaphosa, in whom I had great faith, doesn't appear to see it. And of course, Eja Lungu doesn't see it. And if you go to other countries in Africa, I can mention many of them, they don't see it. And as long as they don't see it, you then see an Africa that is ripe for the picking. And it will be picked. And it will be picked until we, the people, I'm now beginning to think that it's going to be incumbent upon the population of Africa, the African intelligentsia, the African workers, to begin to make pressure bear upon the political class in order to create a bulwark against these new invaders, which include China, which include India, which include the United States of America, which include Russia, which include the European Union, because divided we are so weak that there is nothing that we can do. Right now, as I conclude answering that limb of your question, after COVID-19, the IMF is back. They are telling almost every African country, they are telling Zambia, I know, they are telling Malawi, I know, they are telling Kenya, they are telling Tanzania, they are telling Uganda, you must do what we want. The structural adjustment programs of the 1980s is back, alive and well. And before you and me know it, we will once again be answering to the beck and call of these new neo-colonizers.
After all is said and done, Professor, PLO Lumumba, Kenneth, David Kaunda dies at the age of 97 and is described as the longest and the last in the Pan-African era, not only for Zambia, but, for Africa. When you look at, legacies, others will argue that Mandela has been celebrated, honored, and probably respected more than KK, who might have played a bigger role in terms of, helping apartheid South Africa and others. SADC has honored, KK, most of the countries around Botswana, Zimbabwe, Malawi, Namibia, Mozambique, declaring, 10 to about 15 days, of national mourning. As a Pan-African, scholar and author yourself, do you see this as an end in an era, the death of this towering figure? Is the chapter for Pan-African visionaries closed for Africa, and will this legacy ever continue?
No. In fact, let me now say something that I've never said before. In terms of recognizing the greatest Africans of that generation. In my view, and I say this in my view in order of my own prioritization, I think that the greatest African leader post-independence was Kwame Nkrumah, Julius Kambarage Nyerere, Kenneth David Kaunda, Modibo Keita, and Samora Moises Machel, and a little later, Thomas Sankara and Ahmed Ben Bella. Mandela played his role, but remember, Mandela did not have time to really make the contribution in the manner that the Nyerere and Kaunda made. And Mandela is great. But remember that Mandela comes at a time when a lot of his image is built by Western press. That doesn't take away the fact that he was a great leader. But he's not in the class of Mandela, in the class of Nyerere. He's not, in my view, in the class of Kaunda. He's not in the class of Nkrumah. He's not in the class of Samora Moises Machel. He's on the second tier. And with the death of Kenneth David Kaunda, there is a sense in which that generation has now gone. But a new generation is beginning to emerge. And it will emerge out of formal politics. Because the latter-day African politician no longer has vision. They think of the next election and not the next generation. And as long as you have people whose preoccupation is the next election and how to win it and not the next generation, then you are in trouble. So I have very little hope in the political class. And I don't use the word leaders to describe them. They are not. It's only very few of them that I describe as leaders, and I've already named them. You described Magufuli as a leader. I describe Paul Kagame as a leader. I may have problems with Yoweri Kaguta Museveni, but I describe him as a leader. And apart from that, of the President Lorenzo in Angola is also showing signs of leadership. Chakwera, too early to judge. But if he continues on the trajectory in which he is, could also join leaders. So with that kind of analysis, and I'm not saying that I cannot be subjected to scrutiny and that I may also be wrong, but from where I sit, with the departure of Kenneth David Kaunda, we have lost a very significant group of people. But yet, I believe Kenneth David Kaunda is dead, but his ideas will remain alive. He stands out that he is one of the few leaders who served and saw Chiluba serve after him, not with much distinction. So Mwansa served after him, and I thought Mwansa was going to do great things, but he went too soon. So Rupia Banda didn't serve for long enough. So Michael Sata, not long enough, a little bit of Maverick. Ejalungu, not much. But he was able to see all these. And that is KK's greatness. And he never interfered. I'm quite certain that in his own way, in ways that we did not know, I'm quite certain that his counsel was sought. And if you see Zambia the way it is because of the foundation stone of Kenneth David, the foundation stone that was laid by Kenneth David Kaunda.
Professor PLO Lumumba, thank you so much for that final eulogy of Zambia's founding father and probably the last living, legend in the Pan-African era. And thank you for featuring on Costa on Diamond TV tonight to give tribute to KK. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and stay safe.